It is my pleasure to welcome David Webb to present on Schedules Are So 20th Century, leveraging the apparent disconnect between PSP and Agile Scrum. So David is a Senior Operations Program Analyst at Kehoe Inc. He's currently working as an Agile coach for the A-10 Operational Flight Program team at Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah. Prior to this, David was a government project manager and process improvement specialist with the 309 software engineering group. He has over 33 years of technical program management and process improvement experience on Air Force software. He's a certified scaled Agile framework product owner, a Scrum Master, and an Agilist. And he is also authorized by the SEI as a TSP coach and a PSP instructor. He's worked for the Air Force as a manager, an SCPG member, a software systems engineer, and test engineer. He is a frequent contributor to technical journals and symposiums, and he holds a bachelor degree in ECE from Brigham Young University. So please join me in welcoming David Webb.
Thanks everybody for having me here. I figure this particular presentation, I'm either giving it to the absolute best audience I possibly could, or the absolute worst audience I possibly could. This is about, we're going to tell you about a journey that I took with a team that went from TSP multi-team to scaled Agile, using scaled Agile framework and Scrum of Scrums, and why we did it, how we did it, and some of the lessons we learned along the way, and that the apparent disconnect between TSP and Agile processes, especially Scrum, that we uncovered, and how to leverage that. I'm going to go a quick outline here, who we are, and what the issue was with the team that that I'm supporting, and a little bit about something we called a Scrum thought experiment, and how we took that into the future, and then I'll get into the philosophy behind that disconnect. Kehoe is a small business that does big things. I really think they should make that their tagline. I came up with that. We do a lot of support. The headquarters is in Reston, Virginia, but I'm located at the Layton facility. We have a very, very large facility here in Layton, and I'm contracted to the 309 Software Engineering Group, which is where I worked for over 30 years. And I'm providing them Agile and TSP coaching support. We do a lot of other stuff as well for A-10 and other DoD programs. Moving to the next slide. My dog just joined me. Hang on. Moving to the next slide, the joys of working from home. This is the 309 Software Engineering Group at Hill Air Force Base. For those of you that are not familiar with them, they were one of the first level 5 organizations in the Department of Defense. They have been doing operational flight programs for the F-16, F-22, and now moving into the F-35. And the 520th Software Engineering Squadron, which I led for a number of years, had a rule that every new program that came in would be using the team software process. So what we did is, for all new programs that came in, we used TSP. We trained them in PSP and TSP. We launched them. We had one very large project called the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. This was a Marine Corps project. You can see the picture of it there on the right-hand side of the screen. It was a transformer. It was a sea vehicle that could transform into a tank and back. The software wasn't going well, so they gave it to us, and this was very unusual for a government organization in that we were brought in during the acquisition process while the software was being created, with the idea that we would sustain it once the system was deployed. Unfortunately, due to hardware problems, not software problems, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle program was closed down, but I have heard from folks in the industry that they are still running the software, and to date have found no new defects in it. Very successful program using TSP multi-team. The processes that we took with us when that team shut down. They moved it over to A10 operational flight program. And there was a very large conflict of cultures when they did that. The TSP culture was used to doing things quickly, very, very organized, lots of data management, and the F-16 OFP side had not been using TSP, had been using very defined processes, and they were a level 5 organization. But there was a slight conflict, and it took them a while to get used to it. They brought over process dashboard with them when they came. They used it as their project management tool, but eventually they all moved over to IBM's collaborative lifecycle management tool, which is what F-16 was using at the time. And now that has been used primarily to do A10 work. They adapted it so that it would do TSP-like things. It didn't do it perfectly, and it certainly didn't do it as well as Process Dashboard, but they got to where they were doing pretty well with it. Our issue, as we move to the next slide, slide 5, was a lack of agility. Now, this was not a TSP issue per se. It was a life cycle issue, right? So we would get requirements early in the process through something called an ASARC, which is an Avionics System Requirements Review Council. And they would then take those requirements, they would review those requirements, they would get approval on those requirements, and then we'd enter into a software design phase. And the software design team would launch into software design, and they would get the designs developed, and they would get them simulated. For pilots, they would get feedback on them, they would be peer reviewed, and once the designs were peer reviewed and ready, they would go into the software development team, which would then launch at the same time as the test team would launch to create test procedures and make sure that the testing environment was set up properly. And then they would develop for a number of releases. We call them tapes. I don't think they've been actually delivered on tape for a number of decades, but that name stuck around for a while. So they would do an A tape, everything from the A tape that was found in a preliminary system test and flight test, they would fix in the B tape or the C tape, and the D tape was typically the production tape. The cool thing about this is it worked. It worked very well. Customers got what they wanted. It was high quality. We had a number of different feedback sessions. You can see down at the bottom, we had pilot evaluations that would come in and they would look at what we were doing along the way to kind of make sure we were steered in the right direction. All of these things came out of postmortems that the teams were doing as part of TSP multi-team. The problem with it was when customers' ideas would change. As you can see, we started this last release at the end of 2000 or near the end of 2017, so almost 3 years ago now. And that was after the ASARC had happened and requirements were being developed. And we just now sent the final D release to flight test. So that today mark is a little behind the time. So we sent that out in September, end of September. It will be tested until December, and then that will be the last release that will be using this process. So about 3 to 4 years before it actually gets out into the field, a pilot could literally come into ASARC and pitch an idea and never see it implemented in their lifetime, in their career, even if it went into the very next release. It was taking too long. Not only that, even though TSP can be very responsive to customers and is designed to be very responsive to customers, every time you add in a requirement or take away a requirement or change a requirement, we have to replan, and this causes issues. If we go to the next slide, we decided to take a look at what would it do if we decided to go with a more Scrum-like approach. We thought about taking a pilot project, training them in Scrum, and having them do a Scrum project. Unfortunately, at the time, management and the customer were adverse to this. They had good plans in place. They were tracking them using earned value. They could look at it and see that if they pulled, let's say, people off to go do this this experiment, or even 4 or 5 people if they were key folks, it would have an impact on meeting the schedule. So a guy by the name of Gene Millick, anybody remember Gene? I remember Gene. Who worked for the 309th at the time, suggested that we do something called a thought experiment. Now, I hadn't even thought of this, and I had never heard of it before, but what he said is, you guys have got TSP data. Go in, find one candidate. Now, candidate for change is what's proposed by the requirements at the ASARC, and it gets developed into an actual implementation as part of the OFP. As it was currently done at that time, it was given to a system design team, then given to a development team, tested, and so forth. We would typically do multiple candidates simultaneously in a release. So when we put our TSP plan together, the system design folks would work on all the system designs and get those in a certain condition in order to move into development, which would also do all their development in a certain order. And as an engineer, you may work on 5 or 6 candidates at the same time. You may be switching back and forth in what support you provide. But it's all in your TSP plan, and you all know what it is you're going to do. However, it wasn't a very Scrum-like approach. So what Gene suggested is, can you pull a thread of data out of the process for a completed candidate for a previous release, take a look at all the data and restructure it and say, what if this were done as a Scrum project? What would it look like? What would the team composition have to be? How long would it take to do the candidate, etc. And I thought that was a great idea. So we set about doing that. And what we did is we selected one of those candidates for change that was completed way back in June 2017, before the current version started. It required a wide range of skills, everywhere from system engineering down to configuration management and testing. It was planned and tracked using TSP constructs. Only 258 task hours, touch hours, were used on this particular one, which, by the way, if you look at the 22 months duration, tells you that that team had a problem anyway, right? Because they were spreading themselves out too thin. But it was worked in a traditional waterfall life cycle. So the requirements were developed, and then the design were developed, and the testing were developed. What the team did in order to make a candidate more cohesive is they created an ad hoc team between each of the silos called a candidate team. So a candidate team would consist of the system engineers working on it, and the coders working on that particular candidate, the testers working on that candidate, and the configuration management, etc. They would all work together. So I grabbed all of that data. I grabbed the data that was for all the products that were produced, all the peer reviews that were conducted, all the testing that was done, up to and including integration and system testing. So if you look at the candidate data outline on the lower right of the screen, that dotted line is where I got the data from. So everything from system engineering to integration did not include system testing or integration testing. So everything prior to that was included in this 258 task hours. We had to establish a context for this. So we had our own names for the TSP product components, modules, tasks, and so forth. And so we came up with an Agile equivalent. What's an epic? What's a feature? What's a story? What's a task? And what are story points? And so we took that data set, and with that, I was able to create what it would have looked like, how many stories would have gone into it, how big those stories would have been in story points. By the way, I have another presentation on this exact thing, and it goes into massive detail on how we figured out what story points were and what assumptions we created. But suffice it to say, we were able to recreate this candidate with the data, with stories, and with this a certain number of people on the team. So we synthesized in the data set a Scrum team. We took a candidate team. The original candidate team had 4 systems engineers. There was really only 2 system engineers worth of effort, though, because they switched off on how they did. There were 2 development engineers and 2 test engineers. So we synthesized a team of 6 engineers, 2 systems, 2 developers, 2 test engineers, and then we added a Scrum Master who didn't really produce anything as far as the data set goes. So that was what a team would have looked like. So the system engineers would have represented what we would typically call the product owner on a Scrum team. And the developers would be the developers and the testers would be the testers. Now, we did a few kind of interesting things to make this work. And some of these assumptions turned out to be incorrect. So we assumed that all team members, including the system engineers, would be able to do all the work. So anybody could do design, anybody could do code, anybody could do test. We limited the sprints to 2 weeks in duration, and we figured out how the story points were going to be. So if I had complexity estimates from the team, I used those directly. It got a little funky because in Scrum, they only estimate using the Fibonacci sequence, and the complexity estimates that they used did not use the Fibonacci sequence. And so from a purist Scrum point, it wasn't pure story points, but it was close. If I had actuals but no estimates, for example, peer reviews did not have an estimate as far as size went, in complexity. I looked at the actual task hours and backfired to story points. Next slide. So here are some initial results. Got a total of 111 story points for that particular product, and we looked at what the team could burn down with 6 full-time people, 5 days a week, 10 task hours or 10 hours per week per individual. We were able to burn that baby down in about 3 sprints. So about 6 weeks worth of work, we could complete that. Now, if you look at the number of task hours, that's not shocking, right? As a TSP team, if they had actually just done that one candidate, they might have been able to get it in a similar amount of time. So let's take a look at the next slide. One of the things that Gene, when he looked at the initial data set, said, did you take into account the context switching drag? And I said, the what? What's a context switching drag? So he had me go do the research, and it turns out that teams that concentrate on a single product for a certain period of time can gain an enormous productivity boost over teams that have to context switch between one product and another product as they work. So a single candidate, a single team concentrating on a single candidate can get more done faster than a single team concentrating on multiple candidates simultaneously, for example, which is what everybody was doing at the time. It could be as high as 40%, the average is about 20. So we gave them a 20% context. So if we go to the next slide, we thought a lot about what quality was going to look like. So we worried about quality because we worried about the speed of development. Like I said, the peer review data was included in the data set, but I worried about getting the kinds of quality that we're used to on TSP teams. So we, talking over with Gene, we decided to try and experiment and add to it. Now, pair programming it comes from extreme programming. It's where 2 developers work on the same product at the same time at the same workstation. Now, by the way, with telework, we found out they don't have to be on the same workstation. They can use tools to do that, but yeah, it works pretty well. One developer is the driver, the other is the navigator, and they switch roles back and forth, and they do real-time peer reviewing. For you TSP purists, this works extremely well, but you lose all of the data, right? Because you're fixing defects as you go. But if you look at the downstream impacts, I was blown away by the real data that I actually got when we tried this out on a different project. It was an order of magnitude improvement in quality. I was really, really shocked. So it's similar to doing peer reviews and personal inspections with checklists that we have in TSP. Not as formal, although I have had teams that actually did develop a checklist, and they would do pair work, and then when they were done, they go through the checklist and make sure they got everything done, which I thought was a great TSP bring along that they took with them. So when I was doing the thought experiment, I said, what if we removed peer reviews and added in pair work instead? So I went to the data set. If you can see the next slide, 12. Some of these circles are in the wrong places, and I don't know what happened when I transferred something over. They went to the wrong place, but we reduced the velocity to accommodate pair work. So rather than having all of my effort available, I got about half of the effort available. I also removed the peer review work from the user stories, and found out that it took about 3 sprints again, and this includes the context boost that we had before, but it took about 3 sprints. Now you notice the number of story points dropped. The number of story points dropped because I removed the peer review effort from and the peer review fix effort from the data set. I'm going to stop right here and tell you a lesson learned. This works, but it does not work the way I thought it would. Most teams prefer to do pair work in real life, prefer to do pair work and peer reviews. So when you get to the real data, you're going to find out that it's going to take them longer than what was thought. Also, this idea of forming, I'm going to back up for just a second to slide 8. This idea of forming teams from those various silos works, but what we found is on most teams, the silos remained inside the team. This idea that all team members were assumed to be able to do the work of design, code, and test turned out not to be true in our initial cut at this. So when you'll see the real data, it's going to be longer and larger than what we thought. But some of the conclusions we came to, going to slide 13, is, hey, guess what? It didn't take any more hours. Yay. Well, that was by design. With a focus boost, we could save about 17%, but if you add the pair work in, it actually takes more. However, it would take about, using this analysis, 4 to 6 weeks to create a medium-sized, medium complexity candidate. And with similar quality, we thought, looking at the data set. So we got the same functionality, same quality, and in 12 months, this single 7-person Agile team could deliver between 8 and 12 candidates of similar complexity to the integration process. We were using 100 software engineers to do that in the same amount of time before. So this was a big change. Now, it turned out, like I said, not to be as clean and nice as the thought experiment would have you believe. But with the data, I was able to convince management and the customer to put the thought experiment aside and do an actual pilot. We had an idea of what it would look like. We knew how big the team needed to be and what skill sets needed to be on the team, what they could work on, and we wanted to see if they could really get it done this fast. So we selected a pilot project. This was a new candidate that had not been integrated yet. It was medium complexity. We had a Scrum Master, 2 product owners, a primary and a backup. Those were our systems engineers. Now in real Scrum, they will advocate that product owner be a customer representative, and that's what these 2 folks did. They worked directly with the pilots to get requirements. And then they were very, very good at it. They still are very good at it. We had 2 developers, coders, and 2 testers. We nicknamed them the Agile team or the A team. The funny thing about that is, once the A team was successful, the next team was called the B team, and the next team after that was called the C team. Anyway. We gave them Agile, Scrum, Scrum Master, and Product Owner training, and it was about 4 total days of training. So they got it. It took them a couple of weeks, actually, to get everything, all the training done, but because we didn't do it contiguously. But yeah, it was about 4 total days of training. We used IBM's CLM tool, which has a scaled Agile framework template in it. We weren't really scaling it because it was a single project, but we used that as the framework for the tool. So here are the results. We launched the team almost a year ago. They completed the candidate in 8 sprints. So instead of 4 to 6 sprints, they completed it in 8. So it took them about 4 months. Part of that was we launched them in November. That was really smart because we went right into holidays right after that. So that took them a little longer. We looked at the integration. Integration, as it turns out, integrating a candidate that's developed in this manner, as opposed to being developed piecemeal as the others were being done, turned out to be a problem. There was nothing to integrate it with. We had to actually take a few months and develop the thing to integrate it into, which was interesting. That's been fixed since then, so hopefully that won't be a problem anymore. The quality of the team's candidate was commensurate, in fact, very high with the other candidates. Now, one of the things that in reality made that a reality was they did a lot of demonstrations of this product. So every 2 weeks, they would demonstrate what they had accomplished so far, and we would bring in pilot representatives to look at what they had done. In 2 cases, the pilots came back with ideas that added new features or changed the way features were being done to make it easier for the pilots. I worry a little bit as we go through this in real life about scope creep on things like that. But in this particular case, it made the candidate much, much better and more usable for the pilots, and also identified and removed a lot of defects along the way. So the quality of the final product was not only commensurate, was very high with other candidates. The speed at which it was done, doing something, an entire candidate in a third of a year, had never been done before. And with only 7 people working on the team. It was an eye-opener to everyone. When interviewed about it, the team members were fascinated by what they were able to do and the apparent freedom with which they could do it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time discussing Scrum as opposed to TSP, but the Scrum process is not as heavy as the TSP-PSP process. The data collection that's done on it is primarily done as part of the work they're doing, rather than having to be a tool issue. That they still have to do tools and tracking tools, but it's not as much of an overhead, and the team recommended it. They recommended that the program move this direction. So I was ready to form another Scrum team and try 2 at the same time and look at, hey, what does it take to do multiple teams at the same time? We're scaling this up using something called the Scaled Agile framework. We're also looking at Scrum of Scrums. And the leader said, no, you know what? This is my vision. I want to deliver valuable OFP updates to developmental and operational tests each and every quarter. That has since been changed because the customer couldn't handle it that fast. So it's 3 times a year instead of 4 times a year now. They wanted to form Scrum or Kanban teams of 7 to 11 people. They want to distribute management among the product owners and Scrum Masters. They wanted to hold regular product owner Scrum Master synchronization meetings. That's something we took from Scrum of Scrums. They moved program-wide to a 2-week sprint format. They repurposed our weekly video teleconferences for backlog refinement and sprint review events. They coordinated all these events using, and you can see down here at the 4th bullet, we moved to a 4-month instead of a 3-month sprint. Program increments. Program increments is a term that comes from SAFe. So we basically took SAFe and Scrum of Scrums and we crafted into something that would work well for the OFP community. This is Agile. This is not DevOps. We're not there yet. We're working on it. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. And so this was his vision, and he wanted to pull the Band-Aid off right away. So starting April 1st of this year, we did a mass training of everybody in the program. We mass trained all of the Scrum Masters and the product owners, and we split ourselves into about 11 different Agile teams. And so instead of 3 teams that were very large with sub-teams in them, 3 silos with sub-teams in them, we took that and we cross-pollinated every team so that every team has systems people as product owners. They have developers, they have testers, and they are able to act independently of each other, but in coordination through a Scrum of Scrums. So the old process, as you can see in the Gantt chart up there on the upper left-hand corner, was that we would have this nice schedule that we would do earned value against. So we would do earned value against tape A, tape B, tape C, and the entire delivery. And the new process is we sit back and we say, okay, what epics are we going to plan on delivering in this program increment? And how much work do we think is left on those things? That has really changed the way we look at things. That has changed the way we are going to deal with flight test. This is really, really interesting. So flight test is getting their release, the software, of our software at the end of September, like I said, for our last waterfall approach. They will be finishing the flight testing of that at the end of December, just before the holidays. In January, they will get their next drop, the first drop of the Agile software.
Hey, Dave. Just
Yeah,
to give you just a reference, about 10 minutes left, 15
okay.
At the outside. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just getting into the theoretical stuff. Cool. Okay, so we've got eight candidates in that instead of the 28 to 35 that we've done before. But it's going to be smaller, but it's going to be on a regular cadence. So in January and April and in August and so forth, they will get drops of the software. And then the program office can determine from the results of flight test and the content of each of those releases, whether they want to release those to the field or not. Releasing to the field requires some investment on their end as well. And so they get to decide when it goes out. And we are incredibly more responsive to change than we ever were before. So could we have had the same results with TSP? Sure, absolutely. We could have adapted our requirement structure to more of a product backlog type structure. We could have done launches and relaunches 3 or 4 month horizon rather than a 3 or 4 year horizon. We could have done minor relaunches every couple of weeks at a weekly meeting. A lot of you do stuff like that anyway in your weekly meetings. And we could have implemented some Scrum and XP practices like daily stand-ups, the ability to focus and finish on a single candidate before you do things. We could have mixed things up inside our teams and had multiple support from systems and development on the same team. We could have done pair programming. We could have done test-driven development. There's a lot of things we could have done that are independent of whether we went TSP or Scrum. But the teams were finding, and this was coming from the teams, not from me, because I think if it had been left up to me, I might have pushed for the yes call. But they felt like hierarchical planning that we did, especially hierarchical planning with milestones, tends to drive a waterfall mindset. The training, and you all heard this complaint a million times, the training took too long. Weeks and months of training, whereas the Agile Scrum was a few days, a couple of weeks at most. Pivoting with earned value, especially with the dashboard, not so difficult, right? But we had moved over to CLM, and pivoting, getting the earned value back on track was not simple. Using Kanban, really easy. It was easier, the management felt, to abandon our old processes and to take on Scrum than to try to adapt what we were doing to be more Scrum-like. The Scrum teams are saying that they feel more empowered than they did before using TSP. I think that's because the process is less well-defined, I'll just put it that way. And it's a lot more freedom at the designer and coder level to do what needs to be done to get the software completed. So when we interviewed them, 100% of the designers and coders said they would not go back. However, about half of the testers said they would. And I thought that was interesting. When we queried them on that, it was because there was more structure for them. And they really didn't understand how they fit into an Agile environment. I think we're fixing that now, but there are some things from TSP that I think we could learn. Finally, the bottom line is the Air Force was pushing hard for Agile and DevSecOps practices. And it was much easier for us to say, hey, look, we've gone Scrum, than to say, hey, we're using TSP with Scrum practices in it. And we got a lot of support going that direction. By the way, as a note here, when you do a launch and a relaunch in TSP, it's really more similar to something called Agile release planning, which is multiple sprints worth of effort, like a program increment plan, than it is to doing a sprint plan, which is more of a tactical 2-week type of thing. So did that different? TSP organizes small teams of fewer than 10 people. They like to focus on customer value. Guess what? Scrum organizes small teams of fewer than 10 people, and they focuses on value to the customer. TSP plans using historical data. You know what? Scrum does the same thing. TSP develops iteratively. Scrum develops iteratively. TSP builds in quality. Scrum builds in quality. TSP has well-defined roles and processes. They have well-defined roles and processes. They're not as defined, but they are well-defined. They conduct frequent self-inspections, not only of the products, but of the processes. Scrum does frequent self-inspections of the product and the processes. TSP performs continuous process improvement, and every 2 weeks you do a retrospective in Scrum and perform continuous process improvement. So they're the same thing, right? Not entirely. Is Jim on the line? Jim McHale wrote a report way back in 2016 about how TSP lines up with the Agile practices. And there was a thought at one time that TSP is just another Agile method, right? We can use it as an Agile method. There's a lot more to it. As you can see, this is a quote out of Capers-Jones' books here. There's a lot more to it, but it does a lot of the stuff that Agile did with a lot of extra additives for quality and for schedule management. Now, I think that's where we ran into our discovery that the apparent disconnect is schedule. And that's why the title that TSP is, oh, by the way, thank you, Julia, for reading it properly. TSP is so 20th century. Our schedules are so 20th century. TSP, a main goal of TSP is to deliver value on schedule. They use their value to do that. It's the primary measure of progress. And process past completion tells you whether or not you're getting progress on your product, okay? Scrum, on the other hand, delivers value continuously, or believes in delivering value continuously. Working product, right out of the Agile Manifesto, is the primary measure of progress, and we measure that progress directly by demonstration frequently, okay? And so the big difference here is, what are we concentrating on? Are we concentrating on continuously delivering that value and getting that feedback quickly, or are we concentrating on meeting schedule? Now, I'm not going to go through, because of time, I'm not going to go through all the details on this slide. There's a lot in TSP designed around meeting schedule, okay? And you can see that. There's a lot of schedule support in TSP. Scrum is almost all schedule agnostic, and I'm going to say almost all schedule agnostic, and is more set on delivering value and working products. So our thought was, as going through this experiment and doing it in real life, what are the right tools for the right job? If you have a schedule-centric program that has very, very defined needs in the field for schedule, has pretty much stable requirements, needs actually requires detailed plans in order for communication with the customer, end users, external organizations, and so forth, demands high quality, demands formal risk and issue management, and for which automation may or may not be even doable. TSP and the things that we do in TSP are perfect for that. No due dates, frequent and continuous deliveries desired. Not quite sure what the requirements are going to be until we see it, right? Want more capability over quality. If something doesn't work quite right, but I get an extra feature out of it, I'll live with it till you fix the problem. And automation is capable. It looks like these are two different worlds. But if you go to the next slide on 25, what we found in real life is there's a significant overlap, and there's a continuum here from very schedule-centric, very detailed planning required to I don't want to schedule, and I want this automated and delivered to my phone whenever you get a fix done. A lot of us lie in that overlap in between. There are Scrum teams out there that need stable requirements. There are Scrum teams out there that need to meet a schedule, and they are using Scrum to do that. So there are things that I think we can learn from each of these processes. So here's what our takeaway is, and I adapted some of this from Jim's report and added some things to it. So TSP does some things that Scrum needs. There are some measures that we never take in Scrum that I would love to see us take. Actuals in terms of size are never measured, or rarely measured, I should say. I think the idea of personal reviews is important. Team inspections are actually done in Scrum, but not in the orderly way with checklists that they are done in TSP, and there's no reason why they couldn't be. There's a more complete roster of roles in TSP. The launch process, I think, is key. I actually adapted the launch process for program increment planning that we use now on the A10 program, and it works great. Launch process is something I think that could work for anybody. What if you do have midterm or long-term commitments that you have to make? Would earned value be something that you could actually use in a Scrum project, or something similar to earned value? We don't really have a plan for quality. We have a plan to build in quality in Scrum, but the plan for quality is basically when we find a defect, it goes on the backlog, gets prioritized, and gets burned down. So it's not anywhere near as good of a quality plan as what we're used to from TSP. Risk management happens organically in Scrum. That means that it happens as part of daily stand-ups and retrospectives and demonstrations and reviews, but there isn't a well-defined risk management process. There is one in Scaled Agile framework, by the way, but not in native Scrum. Scalability is an issue, right? There are multiple processes out there for scaling Scrum. We chose a couple, Scaled Agile framework and Scrum of Scrums, but the multi-team approach is actually, I think, something that we could learn from. There's a more explicit design role there. The design role kind of falls to the product owner and the development team currently, and they use something called emergent designs, which works great, but it really doesn't have the rigor of the design role that we have. And Jim put in that there are better pathways to architecture and security practices, which right now Agile teams are building into their automated testing pipelines. And they include things like code scanning and things like that to try to identify security issues early, rather than building them into the architecture. What about, can TSP learn from Scrum? I don't know if this is just the way the 309th implemented it or what, but we ended up with teams that were very siloed, teams of designers and teams of developers and teams of testers. Cross-functional teams, I think, would work really, really well on TSP teams. We should look at trying to simplify the processes. Something that's easier to learn, a little more flexible, and I think in teams that did it really well, they adapted it this way. But I think that the process itself overwhelmed some folks. We need to be able to adapt to requirements easily and replan easily. The nice thing about Scrum is that replanning is just a matter of putting it higher on the backlog. It's really not that big of a deal. Real-time organic workload balancing. So this idea that I pull from the backlog when I'm available, rather than trying to plan out every individual's time, really makes it a lot easier to balance your workload. And balancing workload, as you all know, is critical to getting things done in a timely manner. Has shorter cycles than some of us are used to. We're used to a 1 week weekly meeting, but we're not necessarily used to a 2-week delivery cycle. And the daily stand-ups, I think, are extremely helpful for every team. I think you can introduce that to any team, whether they're using a waterfall process, a Scrum process, any kind of Agile process. The daily Scrums are really, really helpful to make sure that any blocking conditions are identified and removed quickly. So my conclusions are, I think I can skip this slide and we can go to questions. But basically, I wanted to point out that the TSP decomposition working group, we're trying to identify TSP constructs and tools that we can extract from TSP and make them available to Scrum and other teams so that they can use this. And some of the things that we learned from this experiment that happened in the 309th, I think will help us in that. And that's it. I'm open to questions, which I hope I can answer.
Thanks very much, David. Any questions from the group? Any discussion?
Well, hi, this is Bill. I have plenty of questions, but I don't think we have time for them all right now. I've got a 2 o'clock coming up. Let me talk to Julie in particular, because you had some of the same experience I did back in the work at Bettis and Capel. How do you see Dave's expression of the way they were working at Hill as similar or dissimilar to what we were trying to do back in the day on that CAPS project? I thought that a lot of I think the big distinction here was I see a lot more siloing than I experienced, and a lot more emphasis on having a grand master plan. Whereas I thought we were more tactical. We had the teams. We had the cross-functional teams. This was 20 years ago. So I'm just looking for where are the things that where are the lessons that have to be relearned.
Well, I think that there seems to be like conflating TSP with Waterfall, and that's the part I think that confuses me, because you know, I don't think, you know, I think since the very beginning in '94 we've never said that you need to have a Waterfall method. And I know from a management perspective, you know, you either go matrix where you have the designers, coders, testers, or you know, different management styles of how you build your teams. But I do think there's a lot of really, I mean, I still think the points that you brought up are really important, especially the backlog, kind of how Scrum manages backlog versus TSP. I think that's a really important distinction. But I guess, Dave, I had a specific question too. You said you're not there with DevSecOps. What do you think? What are you missing in that area?
For DevSecOps to work, you have to do continuous integration, continuous deployment. And in order to do that, you have to have automated testing in place. And a considerable amount of our testing requires hardware in the loop. And so we're testing that picture I showed you at the very beginning. Those kinds of test stands are pretty common in our environment, and a lot of that is currently done manually. What we did do is we formed, one of our Scrum teams is an automatic test Scrum team, and their whole job is to take our manual testing and get it as automated as possible. Right now, as automated as possible may get us down to a week of testing. That is not fast enough to do DevOps or continuous integration. So we've got a ways to go before we get there. We're also, we're the government. We're in a very, very antiquated development environment where even some of the code doesn't support automated unit testing yet. So we've got a ways to go. It can be done. I'm pretty confident it can be done. We're even having that new display that you saw on the cover that we had there. That particular computer has 2 orders of magnitude more memory and throughput than any of the computers on the aircraft. And it uses modern programming environments. We could start utilizing that computer and doing some more DevSecOps type approaches with it. But we've got a ways to go. And think about it. We just launched into Agile. I mean, the very first pilot project was launched a year ago. So this is
Okay, this is Billy. A couple of comments on that. One of the things I see in a lot of our government customers is that hardware in the loop, and sometimes that hardware in the loop is things like scheduling artillery ranges or flight testing. Talk about schedule driven. You've got real hard, extraordinarily expensive, and I think there's a lot of confusion over the role of Agile in such an environment. What I'm hearing you talk about is you really have to be cognizant of how schedule driven and event driven are you, And I'm not seeing a real
Right.
awareness of that in our government customers yet. So maybe that's something that needs broader dissemination.
Yeah,
On
and
the
I think that's coming, Bill. Especially in the Air Force, where they have the chief technologist now is a former app developer, basically from industry. I think he's pushing us that direction. But what we're doing instead right now, and this is just an experiment to see if it will work, is we're scheduling regular drops. So flight test knows they're going to get something every 4 months. Whereas before, you're right, we had to schedule the availability of the test range. We had to schedule the weapons availability, weapons drop availability, all sorts of things that Jeff knows what I'm talking about. Jeff.
Yeah, and related to that is the problem of the frequency of drops. I was glad to hear you talk about how you had to reduce the frequency.
Yeah.
One of the things that often isn't accounted for is the ability of the customer to consume those changes. We ran into that in companies like the telephone system. They literally cannot accept constant changes because the verification process is way too cumbersome. It's a very difficult thing for them to accept those changes that could have propagation effects throughout their system. And those of you who have sat through forced updates are well aware of the risks. On the also on the DevOps side, there's a strong belief in the DevOps world, and you're seeing this again coming out of the Air Force CIO, that faster releases, continuous deployment is important. And that's not necessarily a practical thing. Continuous deployment is probably not going to be practical in a lot of DoD environments. You're going to have to come to terms with what does that really mean. On the automated testing side, one of the risks we always ran into was we had automated testing back 20 years ago with Fortran programs, but the thing was we couldn't automate it at the unit test level, and even if we could, it was always hampered because propagating effects as you made changes completely wrecked the automated testing system. You would have spent twice as much time maintaining the test base as you did the code base if you insisted on having a purely automated unit test system. So we had to keep our expectations kind of in check on all that.
All right, Bill, I don't want to cut you
Another
off,
thing.
but we're almost out of time. So Dave, I'll let you answer, and then we just have to wrap up with some C business at the end. But we can stay on after we do that.
Actually, I think we're seeing some of the same things Bill did. I think the one disconnect, Julia, that you brought up, though, which is, does it have to be waterfall? It doesn't have to be waterfall. We never said it had to be waterfall, right? However, it appears to me, after coaching a few dozen teams over the years, that teams do move to a waterfall process because primarily of the hierarchical planning method that we use in TSP. Doesn't have to be. And I think those of us that have been around TSP for a very long time see that clearly, but the other folks don't necessarily see it. And I had been away from the ATN team for a number of years, and then when I came back, there were some crazy things going on. I'll talk offline about that, but they had gone very, very strict waterfall, very strict earned value, and it was very difficult for them to change their earned value planning when things changed. And they made some arrangements to make it more easy that in the end kind of invalidated the earned value. So it was a good move for them. But I think there are some things that rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, we should bring some of those things from TSP with us.
Yeah.
And I would love to see some of the constructs from the TSP decomposition working group get utilized.
When you say you release every 2 weeks, like, I guess I don't know what that means, because like for us to release a software version, like most of the places I've worked, IBM, Uniswitch, Signal, and clients I've worked with, there's so much overhead associated with release that it wasn't cost effective or efficient to release every 2 weeks.
So let me give you two experiences that I've had. One is where we are now to the point where they release by story. That's how fast they can do it now. The other is the exact opposite, which is what I am on A10. It may take a year, right, of all sorts of coordination. We're trying to get that smaller, but the first one was something called Personnel Recovery Command and Control. Personnel Recovery Command and Control is a web-based, now cloud-based system that tracks your transponder when you go near or maybe even over enemy line. So they can extract you if you get in trouble. It's incredibly important, and it's used by everybody in the DoD, including and CIA and FBI and a bunch of other folks too. And there are two sides to it. There's the side that the users use to put their information in, and there's the sides that the management of the system uses to track everybody. That we did TSP on that one. That we did with a more of a waterfall process for many years. And the customer they worked with us, and they got to where we and the customer were simpatico on what releases looked like, and it was very much like you described. And then the customer changed, and they hated us. They absolutely hated us. They hated looking at earned value charts. They felt like we were lying to them because we weren't actually, they couldn't see software, they couldn't put their hands on it, they couldn't see it. They would ask us to do something, and we would come back and give them a plan for when it would be put together, and they said, we don't want that. Why don't you just do it? Just do it. Why you don't need to put a plan together, just go do it. It was a very frustrating relationship for a TSP. It was like a level 5 software developer with a level 1 customer, right?
Yeah.
We blamed a lot on the customer. However, the customer said, hey, I've seen this Agile stuff work. So they literally grabbed my project managers, took them to an Agile training course with them. And they both walked out with an idea of how it could work for them. And they did a massive transition, first to Scrum, then to Kanban, and then to DevOps. They reduced the documentation needed for that product by about 85%. What they did is they sat down with everybody, all the end users, everybody, and said, what do you use? Engineers, what do you use? You know, everybody. And they found out there was a ton of shelfware out there.
Right.
They also reduced the user's manual. The user's manual gets updated yearly now, but they do release notes every time they release, which is all the time now. Then they developed a pipeline that they can throw a change into, commit it to a build it, get it 100% unit tested, user interface tested, all of the information assurance and security, external attacking type stuff that they do, scans, everything done in about an hour. So in an hour, you'll know whether or not your software is accepted into the baseline, or if they kick your software out and revert to the old baseline. That was huge. Then the second thing they did is they cloud-based it. And once they cloud-based it, they could literally work on a duplicate of the fielded system at the same time the system is in flux, so that we got the blue system and the green system, or is it the other way around? And then when they're ready to release, they just do that. And it's been working incredibly well for them. They were one of the first DevSecOps programs in the Air Force. They weren't the first, but they were one of the first. That is one extreme. The other extreme is I've got an A10 OFP that has tech orders that have to go out with it. The tech orders have to have graphics. They have to have step-by-step instructions for pilots. They have to be vetted. They have to go through several different stages of reviews, because you don't want the tech orders to say something wrong, right? And that has to happen after the software is done. Otherwise, there's a risk that it won't match up, right? And so even though you develop it while it's going, you don't complete it until long after it's completed. That's just one part. Like you said, Julia, there's a packaging overhead that happens in sending any type of release out. So what's a release? And we've had a lot of discussion about what a release is. By the way, I got to go in about a minute. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, we all have to
We had a
go.
lot of discussion about what a release is. And we're tracking it, Claire, until we get to develop. We just drew it up a boundary and said our release cycle is when we get it to developmental and operational testing, we're done. And then anything that comes back from that goes into our backlog and we work it and burn it down and get it out the cycle. So even though we have a TO group that would be working post-release, if you will, our releases, we're counting them right as they go to do OT.
If you just have a minute, I'm just going to see if anybody else has a question.
Yes. Jeff's raising his hand.
I've been texting you, David, as you know.
Yes.
And my big question is about, at one point you talked about how the Scrum side is dealing with quality. Then later there was a lot of information about not dealing with quality compared to TSP. And I would love to talk to you sometime about technical debt.
I think it's
with all of these things like
technical
DevOps and the other stuff that you're referring to, I think there's a lot of technical debt issues going on there that we should talk to in more detail.
I agree. And I think that one of the things that's powerful about Scrum is the short life cycles. Because if you do have technical debt, you can find it and burn it down quickly, as opposed to being locked into that for a considerable amount of time. But that's also a TSP-ism, right? With TSP, we had this rule of thumb that said any plan, you probably should replan completely after 3 months, right? Because it tends to, well, I mean, that's a program increment, 3 to 4 months. So it's, I think we're coming to the same conclusion from different directions. In the case of A10, one of the things I found is after I left A10, after I left A10, things went kind of sideways. The training didn't happen the way I wanted it to. They came back, and I just to tell you one horror story, and I heard this from a number of people, I only have to work 2 hours a day. This is great.
Yeah.
Well,
What?
that's what I was wondering. I was wondering a little bit about Hawthorne effect there.
Yeah. Well,
And
until
an
they
exceptional engineer, like having that exceptional person that can make anything work in any circumstance.
Right.
Yeah. I just one last thing I'll mention, David, is I suggested you and I, Brad, maybe Alan, others, that we talk, because we've been doing some things inside of TSP, or what we call TPI and NavAir, that are very short cycle-like. And so I think there's that, the technical debt issues, the quality issues, all of that we want to just talk about further, and how do we take it forward, and some of the other things that we're doing with investments in process dashboard and plugins for Scrum tools such as Jira. So a lot of stuff going on there that we can chat about.
Yeah, that's great.
So in our TSP decomposition working group, one of the things that we've gone back and forth about was this question: well, is TSP just another Agile method, and is it orthogonal to Scrum, where Scrum is basically like a life cycle, and TSP is at life cycle agnostic? So that was a question. And one of the during our discussions, one of the things that we discovered is that the biggest difference between the pure Scrum approach and the TSP approach happens in launch meeting 0. Launch meeting 0 in TSP, a TSP team has an expectation that somebody can come in and tell them what's needed, and that we can agree at the end of launch meeting 0 what the requirements are and what the expected scope is that we're supposed to plan. And a Scrum team explicitly does not introduce that requirement. They explicitly say, well, we can just start with the backlog, and then we can let the customer change their mind continually. And so from that standpoint, in Dave's presentation, he talks about a difference between a focus on schedule and a focus on value. Maybe a better way to think of it is that TSP has a focus on keep making and keeping commitments, whereas Scrum has a focus on preserving flexibility for the customer. And so that's maybe the biggest difference, I think, between that has nothing to do with Waterfall, but has more to do
Right.
with maybe a fundamental difference between the two approaches.
It seemed like TSP's focused on how long is it going to take to build this, whereas Scrum is like, okay, in the next 2 weeks, what can we build?
Right.
Right. So one starts with a fixed period and says, okay, how do we fill our time? And the other one's like, how long will it take us to build this thing?
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember in my first TSP project at Hill Air Force Base with Dave Webb as my team leader, Walt Humphrey came out and supervised our launch. And we had this question, which was, we were concerned, we were in our risk management session, we were concerned about the possibility that requirements could be volatile. And he says that our customers might need to change requirements. And this is what Watts said, and it stayed with me to this day because it just, my jaw hit the floor. He says, volatile requirements aren't a risk, they're an asset. And we said, what? He says, here's what happens. Let's say that you're in your project, you're working along, and you realize that you're about 2 weeks late. And about that time, the customer comes to you with a change. You can look at the change and say, yeah, we can incorporate this change, but it'll make us 2 weeks late.
Watts was a master at that. He said that they came and made a change, and he said, okay, it'll take 2 months. Then he came back like 3 weeks later and said, okay, well, we want to go back to the original. And he goes, well, that's another 2 months. He's like, every time you have to make them redeploy, that takes time.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that, it really caught me off guard to hear Watts say that. Like I said, my jaw hit the floor. But now that mindset, and now compare that to an Agile team and what their mindset is with their interaction with the customer. Because if you have a customer that doesn't have hard dates and the customer is just happy with a continual stream of value and they don't have hard dates, and you can remove that from the conversation, if that's your customer, then giving your customer the ultimate flexibility to change their mind at the end of every 2-week sprint is kind of a nice capability. So.
But see, David, the way I think about it is I think that, like, to me, TSP separates the engineering questions from the business questions. And so the business questions is, how do I deploy my people? What content do I need by what date? Obviously, if I'm Xbox, I need a game update by whenever in time for Christmas for the kids, right? And the TSP is giving you a sound engineering plan and sound engineering alternatives of how, well, we can put more people on this, or we can extend the schedule and produce the same functionality. We can provide this functionality in increments to separate the engineering options, options from business decisions, which are like, what products do you want to, I mean, even if you're that or anybody who doesn't really have, like, you know, a strong schedule-based commitment thing, like maybe TurboTax does or something. So I still think that's a really valid way of distinguishing an engineering plan from a business plan. And I see that gets lost in Scrum, that distinction of a, you know. So I always see, like, your engineers are using TSP to give your managers the information they need to make valid business decisions. So thanks, everybody.